Happy New Year. 2026 is now here. And as expected, it started off with a lot of things going on. I think it's going to be a good year. I'm pretty excited. I just hope we don't end up in some more with any, I hope we don't end up with any wars around the world that we don't plan for. There seems to be a lot of agitation going on. Some of it I think is a bit unnecessary, but who am I to say? I'm here to comment on the LNG and the gas industry, and I think we'll keep in our lane, so to speak. But unfortunately, our lane is getting increasingly crowded. Today's topic I want to talk about is the politicization of LNG. And yes, I've kind of touched upon this before, but I think it warrants a discussion by itself, which is what we're going to do today. So, a bit of history here. The LNG industry started off really in gusto in the 70s and 80s. And at that point, it was multinational companies, the Shells and the Totals of the world, developing resource in many of the oil-rich countries of the world. And these resources initially were oil and then became gas when the gas needed a market, and they became the LNG projects. And for the longest time, LNG supply was pretty much dominated by a handful of international oil companies, Shell, Total, Exxon, as the main ones, and in partnership with a lot of national oil companies. And the national oil companies effectively were the state, the host government. They were owned by the state. And these would be the Pertaminas in Indonesia, the Petronas in Malaysia, the Sonatrachs in Algeria, the national oil companies in Nigeria, ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, and then to a certain extent, some of the Russian entities as well, Gazprom, and then I guess Gazprom is the main one, but Novatek and others as well. So they became de facto LNG suppliers, which were plants operated in partnership with international companies, but largely still controlled by the host government. And in that case, there was a lot of government involvement in the LNG, a lot of government involvement in where the LNG went, a lot of government involvement in what the prices that were charged, because in a lot of these places they had regulated markets without a real price of gas. So the government, in essence, dictated the price of gas, dictated the cost of operating the LNG plant, and pretty much told the international companies, this is the price that we want you to sell the LNG, or this is the revenues that we want. And then the international companies ran around and flipped that and sold it around the world. And I think everybody knew that LNG, in essence, was a very much a government controlled entity. And this was very, very successful for the Russians and the Qataris, for instance, who could dominate the market in many countries. And it became a government to government transaction. And of course, if you upset the one government upset the other one, there was a very easy possibility to stop the gas to flow. Didn't happen very often, thankfully, but it did happen a lot in the pipeline industry. The Russians are very good at using their pipelines for political reasons. When the Ukrainians upset them before the war started, they would quite happily turn off the pipe. And one can argue the reason the Iran-India pipeline was never built is because there was Pakistan in the way, and India and Pakistan could not see eye to eye and to trust each other. So politics has always been a big part of this. And these international companies, the Shells and the Totals and the Exxons of the world, kind of knew how ANIs, to a certain extent, knew how to navigate this and play that balancing. They could keep the host governments happy and yet make a pretty healthy profit. All of this changed when the United States entered the LNG supply world. The LNG industry in America to this day is dominated by independent companies that have very little connection to the government, if any. A lot of them, I would say all of them except maybe Sempra, which is of the producing LNG projects today, all of them except the ones controlled by Sempra and maybe the ones in Cove Point are actually started off by entrepreneurs, much like myself. And then some of them became listed entities. Some of them got different shareholders. Some of them are still operating as independents today. But the international companies, the household names, the Shell, the Exxons, the Totals, were largely absent from the US industry. They have now since got a little bit more active, especially on the trading side. But really, the US industry was one of independence. And the kind of the ethos of our independence is I'll do whatever I want. Mr. Government, kind of stay out of my way. International companies, stay out of my way. Let me make my decisions on volumes. Let me make my decision on price. Let me make my decisions on market. And the US government actually was very, very kind of complicit in this. We had to apply for certain permits. The FERC permit, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission permit, was largely a technical environmental safety permit, not at all related to where the gas was going to be marketed or the price of the gas or LNG. The DOE, the Department of Energy, did require you to get an export permit, but it was kind of a blanket permit. If you want it for free trade countries, which were 15 countries that America had a free trade agreement, or non-free trade agreement countries. And it also made explicit that a handful of countries, the North Koreas, potentially the Irans, the countries that were considered axis of evil, we could not export to them. But how much we exported to any one country, the Department of Energy really didn't interfere. If you wanted to sell all your cargo to Japan or sell some to Europe or whatever, that was your independent strategic decision. And I think the system actually worked very well. And the proof is in the pudding. The US is now the world's largest LNG producer, and likely to continue staying that way once the next wave is over. Yes, for a while, maybe Qatar will get the crown, but the amount of new projects in the States that are happening and are under construction and will happen, I think the US will ultimately become the world's largest producer again, not that far away. And so that proves that limited government interference, limited politicization of LNG work very well. Well, that has all dramatically changed in the last, a year or so since the new administration came along. The new administration has been taking a more active role. I think, on a positive sense, it has now made the permitting system a bit more transparent, a bit more efficient, and we all like that because under the last administration, I think the permitting system became political. It became very anti-oil and gas, and they were told to drag their feet, the agencies. And even if you got the permit, there was no security in that permit being valid for forever. I think, to the new administration's credit, they have now removed some of that uncertainty in the permitting, which is why you see many projects, including Gulfstream, like I've said, Gulfstream, my project, which is all about trying to go through the permitting process right now because it's efficient and transparent, and we think the government and the administration is very supportive. But there is some potential negative consequences as well by having the government actively involved. The government is this. I'm talking about the U.S. and we'll talk about other governments in a minute. But the U.S. government is now, pressuring a lot of the allies to buy more American LNG. I don't know if that's really necessary. They were already buying a lot of LNG anyway. The Japan, Koreas, Europe, they were all buying a lot of U.S. LNG anyway. So I don't know if the added pressure is really productive or not. The US government is pressuring a lot of the allies to invest in US LNG projects, especially the Alaska project. It seems to be the most political of all of them. But in essence, these countries have been already investing in US projects. We have seen the Japanese take a lot of equity stake in independent projects in the US. Freeport, of course, comes to mind. We have seen equity interest by the Middle Eastern entities, and both private and as well as non-private. And we have seen equity interest by the European majors, etc. So these things were already in place, and I'm not sure that the government now insisting on more of investment is really that helpful or really that necessary. Um, I think it could be counterproductive because if entities feel they're under pressure by the government to invest in US projects, foreign entities pressured by the US government or their own government to invest in US projects, they may or may not make the right decisions. And these decisions, I would like to see them based on commercial merit, on technical merit, rather than on political merit. Another worrying trend is the second derivative, we call it. The US has threatened last week, I don't know if this is going to stick or not, that any country that trades with Iran could potentially be subject to American sanctions. Well, who trades with Iran that we care about in the LNG space? Well, Turkey trades with Iran, India trades with Iran, China trades with Iran, the UAE trades with Iran. There's others as well. Now, a lot of these guys that I just mentioned, Turkey, India, China, have been buying a lot of US LNG. China being an exception in the last year, but they're still contracted a US LNG, so I think it counts. Do we really want to sanction them if they're already buying American LNG just because they also trade with Iran? Is that really helpful? And is that just another evidence of the increased politicization? The US is now the largest supplier of LNG to Europe, largely because of the Ukraine war, which doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. The Europeans have wisely turned away from depending on one government owned entity, Gazprom, which for its gas, but now looked at the US because I think partly because the US is an ally and the US the LNG was coming from independent suppliers who were not controlled by the government. Cheniere, Venture Global, Next Decade, all of these guys, Freeport, they're not controlled by the government and they're not colluding with each other. So, European buyers felt very comfortable in making independent deals with them, just like everybody else. And they thought it was a good counterbalance to what they did with Europe, with Russia, which is all buying from Gazprom. We are now the largest supplier of LNG to Europe. If the US government starts taking an active role in the supply and the marketing of our American gas into Europe, I'm afraid that it could be perceived as being US government controlled gas. And I don't think that's productive or really helpful or required. I would rather see us just compete as we do. Now, other countries have also played the political game. We know that there's a lot of government to government contracts, government to government deals that happen, which encourage certain players to participate. The government of government of Oman and India are close, government of Qatar and India are close, and that's why India still imports a lot of LNG from Qatar. Government of Pakistan is dependent on place people like Abu Dhabi, and so they also get a lot of trade back and forth, and oil as well as gas. These things are always going to happen on a government to government level. I just hope that we don't see that increase more than we have to. So I guess in a nutshell, I think my conclusion is I would rather see us not have LNG become political, but I think it's kind of happening. I think LNG industry, especially in the US, has grown quite nicely, quite in a very organic manner, without a lot of overt government involvement. I think that has made American gas very competitive, very appealing to a lot of buyers around the world, and it's changed the pricing systems around the world, which I think is good for all the industry anywhere in the world. Um, I would like to see that continue. If the US government pressures Japan to invest in Alaska LNG, what happens to the price dynamics of that? I don't know. I'm not privy to those discussions, but is it really necessary? I think the Alaska LNG project, if it's a good project, should stand on its own. Let's change gears a little bit. I noticed there was a press release by Venture Global that talked about their earnings report. And what number really struck to me is that they made a statement, quite a transparent statement, that said that their liquefaction fees in their newest project, which is still under construction in Plaquemines in Louisiana, is now around $6 per MMBTU compared to $2 in their first project on the other side of Louisiana in Calcasieu. So the same company, largely the same technology, different scale slightly of the projects, but many, many similarities, has now experienced a 3x in their liquefaction fee. And let's be clear, what drives liquefaction fee is construction cost and interest rates and materials like steel and inputs like labor. So just in a very short period of time, we have seen their liquefaction go up 3 times. That is not good news. That goes back to that cost inflation I've discussed in previous videos. I am worried about cost inflation. I would rather see us not have the cost go up so high. I think that we have a bit of an overheated construction system going on in the US Gulf Coast. I think this is not a great time to be building new projects. I think it's a good time to permit, as I said, which is what Gulfstream is doing. But there is an overheated environment going on, and that's reflected in Venture Global's statement. Just a quick back of the envelope, and again, this is all based on my just very crude assumptions. If the feed gas is $4, let's say that average about $4 in the last 6 months, and it takes 25, 30 cents or even 50 cents for the gas to get to the LNG plant, and you add another bit on OPEX, maybe 15% or $4, which is another 30 cents, 40 cents, 50 cents, just in that number, you are now $5 plus the liquefaction fee of $6. You are over $10 FOB price for that LNG plant in Plaquemines Parish. $10 FOB makes it very hard to sell into Europe or Asia when their market price is $12, $14 regassed in the grid. So this is start squeezing the economics. I think it goes back to saying that we have to really look at our capex very carefully. We could really kill the golden goose, so to speak, if our costs get too high. And again, this is based on public information that Venture Global said. It just shows that when capex goes up, I've heard capex going up 30, 40% in the last few years, it directly reflects on liquefaction. And in this case, the liquefaction fee has gone up 3x, 300% or 3x. Not great. Let's end with a positive note. There's a lot of great movement on Texas LNG, my old project. I was a CEO of that project for 9 years. I founded that project in 2013. I was CEO to 2022. We sold the company to Glenfarne in 2019. And I think Glenfarne deserves a lot of credit for getting that project close to FID. The news has been very positive in the last week about Texas LNG get to FID. I'll be very, very pleased if they get to FID. It's nice to see something that I created from scratch, from nothing, become a $4 billion FID sanction in the next few months, we hope. Let's keep watching that one. Gulfstream is still plugging away. My Gulfstream LNG project, we are completing all our environmental work, and we're still looking to begin FEED as soon as we get some more funding. So we're looking for funding as well. So an exciting time in the business, as always, but let's try to keep the politics out of it. Thanks again, everyone.